As America continues to implode from within, the era of the dollar's exorbitant privilege as the world's primary reserve currency is coming to an end. The US living standards are about to be squeezed as never before. We import everything, and the only things we export are wars, mortgage-backed securities, and the US dollar. Our nation's wealth is being drained, drop by drop, because our government continues to mount record deficits. The security of our country depends on the fiscal integrity of our government, and we're throwing it away. The contraction of GDP is currently worse than that of the Great Depression, which then stood at 33%. Today, contraction of GDP stands at 50%. We can safely conclude that we have entered into the greatest depression ever. Our national debt is going to eventually catch up with us, and it will be painful for all, and this has been a long time coming. Just how much money do you think the Fed can print without other countries balking at buying our overinflated notes? The world is also tired of the US threatening to ruin their economy by the dollar if they don't toe the US line. Gold-backed currencies, decentralized cryptocurrencies, and trading commodity for commodity is the way around that. Settlement in the US dollar has dropped in recent years when it hits 50%. Its days as the world's trading currency are over. The Federal Reserve note is a debt-based pyramid scheme. Other nations no longer purchase our bonds or debt. The record of history proves that paper currencies always hit their intrinsic value of zero. We are well on our way. The weaponization of the dollar and the US banking system by Trump is why the dollar is weakening. Add to that the Fed printing trillions and the government borrowing trillions to prop up the markets. Factor in also record and historical debt loads. The Fed and the Fed system of banks are now the major and almost sole purchaser of US bonds. The US financial system is taking money out of its left pocket to put it in its right pocket. Are you expecting a V or a W recovery? Forget about it. It's going to be an S and no recovery for the markets. Get out now, it's a sucker's market. All short-term Fed-induced liquidity. Oil stocks will drop back to half of the previous lows. The Fed is pumping money into the stock market to make people think things are great. Wake up. It's all smoke and mirrors. The equity value of stocks is less than meaningless. 2008 should have taught everyone that. Thanks to the financial propaganda press, the divergent curves of the stock market and the real American economy have been studiously ignored by most, at their and everyone else's peril. We are in trouble as a nation. Congress has to stop spending us into deficit. This has been going on for almost 40 years, and the government borrowing escalated dangerously after the 2008 recession. Our whole monetary system is dishonest, as it is debt-based. Our debt is 25 trillion. There are 8 billion people in the world. That means every man, woman, and child on the earth would need to pay $3,000 in order to pay off America's debt. Think about that. It means we will never be able to dig ourselves out. The dollar is already devaluing. Have you not bought anything lately? Grocery prices are way more than they were. It is only the beginning, as the more the national debt increases, the less the dollar is worth. The so-called dollar privilege is largely responsible for the erosion of the middle class in the USA. It did wonders for the 1%, no so much for the 99%. The Walmart effect. The average Joe standard of living has been stagnant for decades, but not the top 1%. As a matter of fact, the top 1% incomes have gone 10,000% for decades. We've got to worry about the world not wanting the dollar anymore, which will mean hyperinflation like Venezuela. We can't print endless money and not say, hey, how about we start paying it back? We are right now 30% stimulus in the GDP. Trumponomics needs to stop. Billionaires are burping with borrowed taxpayers' money. It's time for hard love when it comes to budgeting. The collapse of our economy is inevitable. How can you live at home with borrowing more than you make? That's the USA right now. Living on credit is never a good thing. When asked about the burgeoning federal deficit and national debt, Trump replied, "Not my problem." For far too long, the US has benefited from the unfair advantage of being the reserve currency of the world, printing dollars with impunity, all at the expense of the rest of the world, which has granted such largesse for the sake of economic efficiency. The US leveraged its reserve currency status by demanding that oil can only be traded with the US dollar, hence the petrodollar monopoly. This has not only allowed the US to spend 5 times more on its military than Europe and China combined, but enabled it to meddle in other countries' affairs through invasion, toppling democratically elected governments, and bombing innocent civilians suspected of terrorism. The trillions, being pumped into the economy by the Fed, are being subsidized by the rest of the world as their dollar reserves decrease in value due to flood of US dollar entering the markets. At some point, this house of cards will come crashing down, and it will be caused by US greed and lack of fiscal discipline. The Fed's decade-old grand experiment of creating trillions of dollars of debt, used primarily to enrich the top 5% wage earners, Wall Street banks and insurance companies, and the well-connected like Warren Buffett, has finally reached the point where the endgame is in sight, which is a collapsing, crushing debt bomb. Now it's taking hundreds of billions, even trillions every day, to keep the bubble market inflated. The saddest part of this is the vast majority of politicians and business leaders who should understand the implications of this shift and are in positions to address it are all worried about their next election or quarterly report. The dollar is declining now. That's why stock prices are up. When priced in dollars, stock prices have been declining as the dollar's value shrinks. Once the dollar is dethroned, there will be no world reserve currency. Each nation will have to back their own currency in gold or direct trade commodities. A world reserve currency allows for abuse by the issuing nation. The USA was able to scam the world for 50 years, so it's time to get back to real money and see the real price of things again. The sell-off of the US dollar has already begun. Big changes are coming. It is going to be beautiful. All government-issued fiat has failed 100% in history. The US dollar will be no different. Hedge the dollar and buy tangible assets you own and have no debt tied to your name. Gold, silver, land, Bitcoin. The Federal Reserve was created on December 23, 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. It is a conglomeration of the big private bankers. Those banks run the currency show, control it all through the Fed then, to the government. The biggest con job ever in history. Despite these warnings, Woodrow Wilson signed the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. A few years later, he wrote, "I am the most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." On June 4, 1963, JFK ordered the printing of Treasury dollar bills instead of Federal Reserve notes, Executive Order 11110. He also ordered that once these had been printed, the Federal Reserve notes would be withdrawn and the Treasury bills put into circulation. A few months later, November 22, 1963, he was killed in broad daylight in front of the whole world. 1 week before Dallas, he made that famous speech where he talked about a highly secretive group of powerful people he was going to expose, and with the help of the American people, he intended to spoil their plans. The first thing LBJ did when he took office was to abolish the Treasury dollar printing operation. And all of this barely reported at the time. BTW-LBJ created and pushed through the Great Society welfare state, which is directly responsible for where we are today. And one of Johnson's first acts as president was to repeal Order 11110. 44 nations agreed in 1944 at Bretton Woods to use the US dollar, backed by gold, as the reserve currency for international trade. Created at the same time were the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. In 1971, the issue of gold backing for the US dollar was so restrictive to the US government's money printing and deficit spending that US President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the ability to convert the US dollar to gold. That temporary suspension has become a permanent suspension in practice. The record of history tells us that gold and silver have lasted the war. Nations who left gold out of their support for their dollar, all their currencies, ultimately tanked. Greeks, Romans, Germany, Reichsmark, Zimbabwe, etc. Currency collapsed. The US will fare no differently. The dollar died in 1971, decoupling from gold. As we've seen, it's been reserve currency for almost 50 years. Bubbles can last a very long time. The US dollar will massively spike as one last death cough before its death as the reserve currency. US dollar decoupling from gold ensured its eventual death, but it was far from dead at that time. The reason why America has gotten so wealthy is because of the combination of the dollar's status as a reserve currency and the ability for the US to print dollars without devaluing it due to its status. We got rich off the backs of the countries that used it, but that will come to an end when it dies. When Nixon closed the gold window back in August of 1971, the dollar has been manipulated and is losing its intrinsic value as it slides to zero. The dollar, in comparison to gold, is only worth 1.4% in its actual purchasing power. A penny, 1 cent, back in 1906, bought you more than a dollar does today. Ever since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, inflation has been consistent. The US dollar is often referred to as the cleanest shirt in a batch of dirty laundry. What props the dollar up is world confidence that the US will pay back its debts, and not just the interest on those debts. With the ongoing US injection of trillions of US dollars into its financial system, thus impacting the world's financial systems, it's only a matter of time before a new form of a reserve currency is brought into existence. That could be special drawing rights through the IMF, or even some form of blockchain cryptocurrency overseen by the IMF and agreed to by the majority of the world's countries, despite what would likely be a US objection. The US dollar's loss of reserve currency status will happen, it's just a matter of when and under what triggering circumstance. This will lead to the inevitable collapse of the dollar. A huge national debt always results in higher prices for everything. Neither party had any type of plan to pay down, much less off the debt. History shows that governments have collapsed under the weight of runaway inflation. This is the situation Trump or his successor will inherit. We can't even afford another war to pull us out of this mess. Serious riots will make the current racial riots look like tea parties. People think the recent riots were bad. Wait till the government checks don't clear or they buy 50% of what they used to. The vast majority of US dollars are held by American private banks and the Federal Reserve. The collapse of the dollar without any successful successor will equal a crisis that may be even greater of 1929, maybe even with one. That crisis is already in the works, and there is coming hyperinflation ultimately. Can't continue to just print dollars out of thin air with zero to back it. The existing inventory and underground reserves of gold will be $100,000 or more in ounces in order to cover all the outstanding currency. Countries like China and India with huge stockpiles will reap windfall benefits and become the world's richest economies, while the US will suffer hyperinflation. The debt service that will be likely over $800 billion next year is money that is frankly pissed away, bringing no services to the American people for that extremely large sum of money. If the rest of the world sees us as a bad risk, the price we will pay will be catastrophic. Deficits do matter big time. Who will fund the saving deficit of a nation that has finally lost its exorbitant privilege? The Fed will just print money to monetize the debt, right? Everyone in America now believes that the Fed will fix all problems by printing money. It has worked since 2008, so why not? Should foreigners no longer want to buy US treasuries, interest rates would be driven up to entice them to fund our debts. But that will cause the economy to collapse. Lacking in domestic saving and wanting to invest and grow, the US has taken great advantage of the dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency and drawn heavily on surplus savings from abroad to square the circle. If the return on investment for treasury securities continues to be so pitiful that no one will buy them, the whole scheme comes tumbling down. The dollar has lost all credibility in the context of a reserve currency, evidenced by a whole host of factors. Not the least being that the US tries to bully the rest of the world. The US is totally bankrupt, and the world knows it. Trump has abused it too much. The countries are feeling the angst of placing their confidence in the dollar. If the dollar is a so-called world currency, it has to be in the interest of the world. Lately, it seems that perspective has been lost, and it has been weaponized to serve American foreign policy. The world does not need the dollar. Every country would love to get rid of the petrodollar, which would, in itself, increase the value of their own currencies. What currency is going to fill the void? China has been working toward its yuan, replacing the dollar on the world stage. If the opportunity arises, they will pounce. The IMF already launched their replacement vehicle in July 2018, which aims at replacing the US dollar for those countries that want to do trade using a common currency other than the greenback. IMF's distributed ledger technology has been in place for 2 years now. This replaces the US dollar for trade between nations. It's already a done deal for the dollar as the reserve currency. China's swift move to remove the petrodollar as the world's currency, their expanding economic growth versus the US dollar's GNP to debt ratio of 107% when over 77% signals fiat money collapse, and their expanding global military presence threaten the 1% elite's world dominance, power and monetary control. The dollar will eventually collapse. Don't forget inflation, with trillions of dollars being injected into the economy and negative interest rates on the horizon. What does that mean for stashing cash or equities? A current American strategy in foreign policy has been to threaten banks facilitating trade with countries like Iran and Venezuela. This has been noted by the rest of the world, and alternatives to SWIFT and the US dollar are being implemented. The dramas with Libya, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela relate to the sale of oil for something other than the petrodollar. The US dollar is vulnerable to the development of replacement energy sources. The use of the dollar as a geopolitical weapon has led to the situation where it is being replaced in trade deals. At some point, a lot of dollar-denominated financial paper will end up back in the US prior to a reset. Current trends show that both China and Russia have been divesting US paper. The dollar has about 3 years of life left before there will be a fatal crash. The decline of the dollar's purchasing power has a 95% correlation to the federal deficit, which is exponentially climbing. At the present time, the economy was stunned by the shutdown, but soon more dollars will be pursuing fewer goods and services. Inflation will begin to rise, and at some point, the global credit markets will collapse, at least with respect to the dollar. I don't know about you, but the price of some foods has already doubled. My guess is the dollar has less than 3 years before it is replaced. It's called a currency reset, and we're having one in the next few years. This will finally solve our toilet paper shortage. Got gold, silver, cows, bullets, land, anything but fiat. There should be an international currency, hopefully partially backed by gold. This will prevent endless quantitative easing, and governments will no longer just be printing monopoly money without limits, which has resulted in zero and even negative interest rates. Produced in finite quantities by the sweat of men, gold and silver stand as sentinels to protect the wealth of astute investors in times of currency mismanagement and debasement that is occurring today. Yet only about 1% of the population owns any, outside of jewelry, ironically due to brainwashing by financial institutions, and those with a vested interest in keeping your wealth in the bubble stock, bond and real estate markets. Buy US silver eagles and gold eagles all you can, now that their prices are still very low, due to commercial bank shorting, and you will not regret it. Soon silver and gold prices will really explode as all of the paper money being generated looks for a safe undervalued place to invest in. Most won't listen to what I am saying, but you will remember I told you this, and it is backed by cold hard facts. Issue of currency should be lodged with the government and be protected from domination by Wall Street. We are opposed to provisions which would place our currency and credit system in private hands. Theodore Roosevelt. This was Everything Inside Me channel. Please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell too. And also, leave me a comment. Thanks for watching till the end. Stay safe and healthy.